Oh, I hope everybody enjoyed their meal, especially that chocolate mousse at the end. I liked it. So just a reminder, for the next few minutes, I'll be giving a short speech, maybe about for 5 or 10 minutes, followed by Bob Metz and then Paul McKeever. My talk tonight is going to be about civilization and the fall of it that we're experiencing, because I think that civilization is on the brink. And for those of you who don't know me, first of all, I think there's a lot of people in the audience today that have never attended a Freedom Party function. I'm really glad that you're here. Great to see some of the older faces, too, that have come out for so many dinners in the past. We've been holding these dinners since at least 1985, I think. Because in 1985, I received this pin. Or was that 1989? 89, I received this pin. I've been a member of Freedom Party since 1985. For those of you I haven't met yet, my name is Robert Vaughan. And I've been with the Freedom Party for so long, 1 year after it was founded, 1984. I don't know if there's many people here who could have that longevity except for Bob and maybe a few others. Paul, were you there then? No? 88. You seem to be around forever. I don't know. Rob Smink. Yeah, but Rob's gone out for a cigarette. So that's who I am. I haven't run in any elections, though I've been the campaign manager for many of the elections that we've had, including the last one. So you can blame me for our defeats. It's all my fault. Other than that, I think that I hope to meet some of you at the end of the speeches, and maybe we can have a chat then. So on to the fall of civilization. Now, what do I mean by civilization? I don't necessarily mean the dictionary definition that we see. When you look it up on the internet, they talk about things like architecture, faulty pens. Architecture, things of art, culture, technology, that's what they mean by civilization. But I'm not using that definition. I think that at the root of civilization is the abolishment of the initiation of force. If you have a society where force is abolished, I think that's a civilized society. And it doesn't matter about the buildings or the cars or the technology, which are secondary to being civilized. So this advanced, complex architecture, the culture, technology, division of labor and trade, none of these things could exist without the creation and the enforcement of objective laws, and to the degree that such laws recognize the supremacy of the individual over the collective and his concordant individual rights, such a society could be said to be civilized. You simply have to look around the world today to realize that just because we have technology and art and culture does not necessarily mean we're civilized. If you were to visit many of the countries in the Middle East, Asia, Africa, South America, for example, you'd see great trappings of wealth. Just take Dubai, for example. And you'd see somewhat decent standard of living. But this, I think, is a thin veneer of civilization, concealing a subculture of tribalism, of primitive brutality. These cultures import the technology developed primarily in the civilized West. They're essentially a cargo cult society who enjoy the trappings of freedom but have no idea as to the philosophic and political requirements necessary to create the wealth they enjoy. They have no ideas as to the complex societal conditions necessary to create, not build, but create such items as automobiles, airplanes, computers, machines, skyscrapers. They simply imitate. Now, this is a bold statement of mine. It sounds somewhat xenophobic, and certainly there are exceptions. Japan, South Korea, in Asia, two nations directly influenced by the United States over the last decades. India as well, with over 200 years of history of the British rule. South Africa, with similar ties to Britain and Europe. And of course Israel in the Middle East stand out as exceptions to countries that have adopted and understand how to create wealth, how to create innovation. But by and large, the vast majority of the non-Western world simply copy us, oblivious to the hundreds of years of political freedom, restrained government, and capitalism that set the conditions necessary for the invention, and creative processes that spawned our current wealth of scientific knowledge, engineering know-how, and business acumen necessary for the entire world to benefit from its efforts. But here we sit in the most populous city, in the most industrious province, in one of the freest countries in the West, and yet every day it seems like we're living in the uncivilized parts of the world. We have no right to feel smug about our situation, as the once great West is now falling back into its own tribalistic, brutal, and ignorant past. The cause? The cause is always philosophy, ideas. We can blame such intellectual dim luminaries such as Plato and Immanuel Kant, Karl Marx, Leon Trotsky, John Dewey, or more realistically, more recently, Noam Chomsky, Maud Barlow, Naomi Klein and their ilk. You know who I'm talking about. Secondary to the philosophers of our time, we can blame the politicians who follow their philosophic pap. Tim Hudak, Dalton McGuinty, Andrea Horwath in Ontario, Bob Rae, Thomas Mulcair, Elizabeth May, and Stephen Harper in federally. And each and every leader of every country in the world, without exception, every one of them, has demonstrated their ignorance of what's necessary philosophically to maintain what we know to be civilization. Politically, there are two requirements for civilization: objective laws and the enforcement of those laws. Now, as to how our laws are either objective or capricious, I'll leave for another time. What's more paramount and evident, I think, is the enforcement of the rule of law in our country and our province, or the lack of it, to be more precise. Here are just a few examples of recent local events with Ontario, which illustrate the lack of enforcement of the more basic laws of civilization, laws which all but the most libertine of us can agree upon. The Occupy movement, where hordes of shiftless second-handers break trespass laws, screaming for unearned entitlements. The race-based policing of the OPP in Caledonia, where Aboriginal thugs steal, destroy, assault, and maim with impunity, while a white man who wishes to walk down a public street with a Canadian flag in silent, peaceful protest is arrested. And I don't know if many of you know here in the audience today, we have a man who was arrested today for doing just that. Mark Vandermoss, right here. Gary McHale, right here, same sort of situation. Responsible for going down there peacefully, walking on public property, holding a Canadian flag, simply asking, for example, another man was arrested today, Jeff, for asking an officer for his ID number, his badge number. They arrested him for that. The same police. The black bloc tactics of the G20 protesters in Toronto, setting light to police cars as the police stood idly by and watched it. It's even been speculated that the police did nothing in order to provide proof for the billion-dollar price tag for their presence. The same police at the G20, at the same G20 protests, arresting innocent men and women walking by, minding their own business, as hooded thugs smashed windows, vandalized, and stole with impunity. Who did the police go after? The businessmen coming out of their offices, who walked too close to a fence that Mr. McGuinty said that now you couldn't walk within 3 meters of that fence, unbeknownst to the general public. Today's student riots in Quebec over tuition increases, even though Quebec has the lowest tuition in all of the country. They want to raise it $350 over the next 5 years, and what do you get? You get people wearing balaclavas going out there and smashing and looting, occupying the universities. The entitlement philosophy of these people is apparent, as is their lack of civility. The tasering deaths of unarmed civilians by police thugs, for example, the death of Robert Jasansky, or the tasering of a youth in London, Ontario, my town. In this incident, a youth was fighting on the street, and a London cop simply walked up to the pair who were fighting and tasered one in the face. As it turned out, that youth had been initially attacked, and he was fighting off his attacker. But the police didn't ask questions. They just simply went up and tasered him in the face. It's on YouTube. And if it wasn't on YouTube, we'd never hear about it. The Fleming Street riots. I live not far from Fleming Street in London. Just last month, where 1,000 protesters and rioters, I shouldn't say protesters, they weren't protesting anything, where they were simply rioting, destroyed property and burnt a CTV news vehicle while police stood idly by, unable to do anything because they had known about these riots before, because they've happened before on that very same street. And they knew about St. Patrick's Day. As a matter of fact, the police were there all day just waiting for this thing to happen. And when it finally happened, they did nothing. Again in London, about 30 police moved in on about 250 peaceful pot prohibition protesters yesterday and made 2 arrests. The same police chief whose forces watched as hundreds of drunkards trashed property near Fanshawe College in the city on St. Pat's Day. Why the difference? The 420 celebrations was peaceful, while the college riot was violent. So they saw easy pickings. Let's arrest the peaceful people. Let's leave the rioters alone. Let them blow off steam and just we'll clean up the next day. Again in London, a recent Richmond Row murder. A young man was suckered, punched, and killed on the popular bar strip in London, where every night at 2 a.m., hundreds of drunken revelers pour out of the bars with very little police presence, even though this goes on every night. Fights, and this ended up with a murder. So the list of the failure of the police to enforce our laws is getting longer and longer. The result, of course, is inevitable. Anarchy, more riots, as they know they can get away with it, and violence, and the creeping downfall of our civilization, regardless of the laws that we have. Without the enforcement, it's absolutely useless. We see it all the time. We still may have our technological goodies, but we all enjoy, like the internet and the iPods and luxury cars and warm houses. But what are such things if the police can arrest or even kill innocent or peaceful people while ignoring violent thugs, leaving them to terrorize communities? There's little doubt that if we let this continue, Ontario and Canada will end up like the worst of the world's uncivilized countries, civilized in appearance only, while in reality we'll all become barbarians. We not only need objective laws, we need consistent enforcement of those laws. We need to reclaim the heritage of the West. We need to teach our children of the rich history of reason and freedom our ancestors seemed to take for granted. And as a matter of fact, I think it's probably that they took it for granted that we're in the situation we are today. We need a philosophical and political revolution. We need leaders who understand where we've been and where we should be going. We need leaders like Paul McKeever, and we need political parties like the Freedom Party. Thank you.